I want to welcome our friends on the live stream as well. Good morning. So glad you have tuned in. And just a heads up with the new service times, they will both be live streamed. So if you're not able to gather here in person, absolutely no problem. You can choose one of those. They'll both be on the live stream as well. My name's Keith. I'm the lead pastor here. If we've not had the pleasure to meet, I would love to say hello to you out in the lobby. We're kicking off a new series today, and it's called That. Those three annoying dots. It's kind of like the Prince of series, you know, the artist formerly known as Prince, and it's a symbol. Well, that's the name of the series. And we're going to be talking about that, living in that tension, that place where you're hoping maybe to hear from God, or maybe you've reached out to somebody and you're hoping to hear back. Maybe you want to reconcile, and you're just, you know they've heard it, you know they've received it, and you're stuck waiting. Stuck waiting. When I first signed to play with the Orlando Magic, my first ever road game, I got stuck waiting. I was living in a hotel right down across from the arena because I moved down, made the team, and was like, yay, but I didn't have a car. I had the clothes on my back. And I'm staying at a hotel, and we got our first road game, and I'm in downtown Orlando, and we know the airport's over there, and we didn't fly out of the normal airport. There's a little private terminal because we had our own plane sort of next to the airport, but I didn't know where that was because I was a rookie and didn't know anything about Orlando. But anyway, so I asked one of the veterans, I said, hey, can you swing by the hotel and pick me up to go to the airport for our first road game? And he said, yeah, absolutely, but I don't like to be late. So I'm going to swing through at this time, and if you're there, you can have a ride. I said, no problem. So I came down at like exactly that time. You know, and I stepped out front just to make sure he didn't kind of do a quick sort of drive-through. I was standing out at exactly the time he said to stand out, but he wasn't there. So I'm kind of standing there waiting, 2 minutes pass, and I'm like, well, I-4 traffic and whatever. 5 minutes pass, and I start to wonder if he was running late or if I had been too late. You know that terrible feeling? So this is like we had cell phones, but not like cell phones today. Young people, there was a time where you didn't have a keyboard. So to shoot a text, you had to like hit the number 3 times, It was so I'm sending this long, like basically Morse code text to him. Because I'm not sure if he's come and left or he's on his way. So I shoot this text, and I don't hear back. Now I'm about 10 minutes after, so I called him, because, his phone was the old school kind, of was attached to the car. It wasn't like one you put in your pocket. So clearly he didn't see my text, so I called him. And of course he didn't answer. So I'm now waiting for about 15 minutes, and I'm not sure, is he late or am I late? All I know is I'm getting pretty close to when the plane's supposed to be taking off. So I'm waiting, I try him again, and I'm getting the agony of the 3 dots. I can't make my next move because the last thing I want to do is hop in a taxi and then he comes. So you know that feeling where you're paralyzed, where you're waiting to know you can't decide what to do because you're just lacking that key piece of information and you don't have it. So eventually I'm like, man, I'm getting late here, so I decide I'm going to call a taxi. So I call the cab company, and of course the first thing they do is put me on hold. And I'm like, I'm dying here. So I'm watching the clock tick. By the time the taxi came to pick me up, downtown Orlando, I was 5 minutes before the flight was supposed to leave. And it's at least a 30-minute drive for those of you watching online that don't know Orlando geography. So I hop in the taxi, and here's the thing, I'm a rookie. I don't even know where our plane is. It's not at the normal airport. So I jump in, I say, head toward the airport. I know it's in that general direction. So we're flying there, and I'm like, dude, get me there. There's a tip in it. I'm like, so I watched the clock ticks past when the flight would have left, 10 minutes after it left, 15 minutes after it left. I'm asking the guy, do you know where the Orlando Magic plane is parked? And he's like, I have no idea. And I'm like, I don't either. So we're driving, and I see that kind of that strange, I think it used to be called like the signature terminal. And I'm like, I think it's there. Try there. We come pulling up to the gate a half hour after the flight was supposed to have left. And we pulled through the gate, and the plane is still there. So I hop off, grab my bag, and I'm like, I can't believe they waited for me, man. I'm bigger time than I thought. So I come walking up the steps of the plane, and the trainer is like, he's the guy that knows all. Like, he makes all the major decisions on just sort of the life of travel and things like that. So I walk on, I said to the trainer, I said, dude, thanks for waiting for me. And he's like, we'd never wait for a rookie. And I'm like, why is the plane still here? He said, well, lucky for you, Anthony, one of my teammates, got in a fender bender on the way. And somebody rear-ended him, and the police wanted to come and all that kind of stuff. So he called ahead. So we held the plane for him. Now, extra good for me is the coach's office is in the back. So he had no idea that I was late for my first ever road trip, which would have been my last road trip because as a rookie, my contract was not guaranteed. So anyway, by the grace of God, waiting for those 3 dots, while it was agony, while I couldn't move forward, it didn't quite cost me like it costs us in other facets of life. We know the pain of texting out to somebody. Maybe we want to reconcile. Maybe we don't like the last thing we said as they were walking out the door, and we just, hey, I'm sorry, and we send it out, and it's received, and they started typing, and if it doesn't come through, they probably deleted it and are trying to figure out how to reply, and we watch those 3 dots go across, and it feels like the entire relationship's hanging in the balance. Some of us are in a season of life now where we've been talking to God and we're going, God, I need this to end. And brother, I need it to end as quick as possible. And you feel like you normally have a dynamic prayer life, but have these words just sort of gone up into the cosmos there. And does God hear? And you can feel the pain of the 3 dots where He wants to answer you, but it's like, when? Or maybe some of you have been waiting in anticipation for the next season. Not just get me out of this one, but God, what you have for me, this sense of destiny, you're almost pregnant with it, right? You can feel it. You just know that like the next God move is right around the corner, and you've been praying and you're talking to Him, and it just feels like, when will the waiting end? If waiting is tough for you, you're in really good company. Because a lot of incredible women and men in Scripture had to wait. If waiting is difficult for you, you're in great company because nobody on planet Earth enjoys it. And when I think of waiting and the challenge of it, sometimes I wonder, am I waiting in a godly way, or the fact that I don't like waiting, does that make me like somehow like not a good enough Christian? Is God disappointed in the angst I have while I wait? And we're going to jump into Psalm 69 today, and what we're going to see is David, King David, the man who Scripture says is a man after God's own heart. He struggled with the concept of waiting. When I read his words in Psalm 69, verses 1 through 3, I'm like, that is me. That's how I wait. Let's look at what he says in Psalm 69, verses 1 through 3 as he's waiting. He says, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and the floods sweep over me. I'm weary with my crying out. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim with waiting for my God." David describes the heartbeat, the feeling we have when we feel like God's sending us those 3 dots. He describes it as, he says, the waters have come to my neck. I'm sinking. It's that feeling of like, I've been in this, too long, and the floodwaters are just about like I'm moments from my last gasp, and I'm just gonna try to hang on, but I'm probably going down for the last time. That's a tough place to be. And then he takes it a step further, and he said, it's like I'm stuck in the mire, in deep mire, right? So you think of like the gook of a Florida swamp. You know, you step in and you sink to your knees and you're just like, moving forward is hard. It's trudging and you feel like no matter how much laborious effort, I just can't get anywhere. And he mentions this idea of he can't even get a foothold, right? There's nothing to even get traction on. When we find ourselves in this waiting place, and he's waiting for God, we find these times where God just feels like he pushed pause and there's nothing you can like grab hold of. There's no sense of traction. There's nothing you can do to move forward. You're just stuck. And then he says this in verse 3. He says, I'm weary with my crying out. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim with waiting for my God. He said, I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted. I'm weary. Listen, waiting is tiring. And it's not like David's sitting back waiting in passivity. He says, I'm weary with crying out. The text started out with oh God, save me. It's not like he's going, well, I'll just sort of sit here until the Lord in all his great sovereignty does something. He's going, God, I'm tired of waiting. Help. Please let this season end. Or God, please open up the next season. Or God, please bring about reconciliation. Let me hear back from them. Or at least let me hear back from you. You can hear his heart's cry. And he said he's weary of it to the point where his throat is parched. He's sinking in water up to his neck, but there's nothing refreshing about it that could even coat his mouth. And then this really unique phrase that he actually uses several times throughout Psalms to describe his waiting process. He says, my eyes grow dim with waiting for my God. So it's not only that he feels like he's about to drown, and it's not only that he can't move forward and he feels stuck, and it's not even that he's been crying out. Pretty soon he can't even see straight. His eyes start to grow dim. You know, the longer you stare at something, the less well you actually see it. In our digital culture, and now, my goodness, with Zoom, death by Zoom, right? All we do, it feels like, is stare at screens. Experts recommend the 20-20-20 rule. Every 20 minutes, for at least 20 seconds, look up from your screen and look at something at least 20 feet away. Just shift the focus of your eyes. Get them off of that digital screen that's right in front of you. Every so often, we have to look up, because you know as well as I do, when you stare at that screen, before long, you can't hardly even look at it anymore. Like, you got to like rub your eyes, and you feel like you need to look to the left or to the right, and whatever you've been staring at, I mean, it's like, oh my, I just want to either close my eyes, or what I'm trying to see, start getting double vision. It's just this exhausting staring at the same thing. And David is talking about here, he says, my eyes grow dim. Like, I've been so looking at what you have for me. I've been so staring at this answer I need. I've been crying out, and I'm watching the 3 dots of life go by, that even looking at it, I can't even see right anymore. Waiting's tough. And it makes it very difficult for us to see. Now, here's the thing about David in this situation, is he's actually, despite it sounding like, really, like he's been reading my mail about how I feel when I wait, he's actually personally not in a bad spot. Like, his walk with God at this moment in time is great. It's not like he's sort of in some like cosmic timeout where God had him sit in the corner for doing bad things and eventually he'll be allowed to participate in life. He's doing well. He's doing the will of God. But sometimes even doing the will of God and desiring godly things, he still brings us to these places of waiting. It says this a little bit later in Psalm 69 and verse 9. David says, for zeal for your house has consumed me. He's excited about God and exhausted from crying out to God. He's captivated by the beauty of God, the purposes of God, the fulfillment of God's will in the earth, the house of God, the fullness of the work of God is consuming his heart, yet in the same place he has to wait. And in the process of being consumed by God, he's also sitting in jeopardy of not being able to see God as his vision grows dim. Here's the reality. I think it's safe to say for all of us. None of us loves the feeling of waiting. And that's what David's describing here, what it feels like to wait. What it feels like to need an answer and feel like we're getting the 3 dots. None of us loves what it feels like to wait. But we all actually love the end result of waiting. Because while waiting doesn't feel right and feel good, it actually does produce good. Because unlike those 3 dots, unlike that ellipse where we find ourselves waiting, unlike that ellipse, you're not on hold with God. You're in a process with God. Look at how Moses describes the end result of waiting in Deuteronomy 34, verse 7. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. Moses' eyes at 120 were not dim. David describes, it feels like my eyes are going dim. Now, either Moses just never had to wait and experience what David was talking about, or the feeling that David was talking about can be overcome and can produce what happened in Moses' life. Now, just a quick reminder on Moses before we think he never had to wait for anything. It says here he was 120 years old. Moses didn't first hear from God in a meaningful, significant, hey, Moses, I have something for your life, way until he was 80. For 40 years, he sat in the palace of Pharaoh, the richest, most powerful man in the biggest empire in human history at that point. Spent 40 years in his palace. No real significant interaction with God that we know of other than God kind of sovereignly moving his life. Then he spent the next 40 years literally on the backside of nowhere. No real meaningful interaction with God that we see other than God's general sovereignty in his life. And then at 80, God speaks to him. Now, I hope I don't have to wait till I'm 80 for God to decide that I can do something with you. I hope he picks sooner than that. But Moses was a man of God. He just hadn't heard from God for 80 years. And my guess during that process, he felt some of the things that David must have felt, including a lack of clarity of even seeing what God wanted, his vision going dim. Oh, by the way, then when he does get called by God, his call is to take 3 million vagabond, ungrateful people and wander around for 40 years with the purpose of eventually leading them into a place that it took 40 years of wandering to even get near. So even when he was called, he had to wait for 40. I don't want to wait 40 years to enter into something God has for me, let alone those 40 years coming after 80 years. But what we're going to find in the life of Moses is that Moses allowed the waiting of God to produce in him what it doesn't feel like it's producing. There's a difference between what waiting feels like. My eyes are going to go dim. There's a difference between what it feels like and what it actually produces. That Moses' eyes did not grow dim. Now, a couple quick thoughts here. When you look at Moses' life, we mentioned very quickly that for 40 years he sat in the palace. Most of what we know about Moses' early life, you probably fill in the details mentally, but it basically goes like this. And by the way, it's only mentioned in 10 verses in the Bible. From the time Moses' mother conceived, Pharaoh said, you're not allowed to bear Egyptian sons or Israelite sons in Egypt anymore. His mother had Moses, put him in a reed basket, sent him down the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter went down for a bath, saw this little boy in a reed basket, said, I want to take him home for my own. Takes him home for his own, says, well, I need a nursemaid, goes and gets, go figure, Moses' mom to nurse and raise Moses in Pharaoh's palace. For 40 years, he's treated as a son in the house of the most powerful empire, the leader of the most powerful empire on earth. And by the way, that's recorded in 10 verses. 40 years of royalty and majesty in 10 verses. Oh, the next 40 years of the backside of nowhere is recorded in 13 verses. The total of it is Exodus chapter 2. His first 80 years is one chapter, 13 sentences of him on the backside of nowhere. 80 years of his life. The remaining 40, when he's walking in the purposes of God, takes the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, a significant chunk of Hebrews, at least 3, and all throughout the New Testament, at least 3.5 books of the Bible. Which means waiting for us feels different than waiting to God. For us, it's 80 years. For God, it's an insignificant footnote and a blink. Oh, yeah, there's 40 years where he's in the palace. That was 40 years. Oh, yeah, there's 40 years you're on the backside of nowhere. I don't know about you, but 40 years of sitting on the backside of nowhere feels a little more painful than just like a couple sentences. But what feels like an agonizingly long time of waiting to us is a blink of an eye to God. Here's the other thing that's important to notice is the part of God's story in Moses' life, the thing that's powerful, the thing that's interesting, the thing that is worthy of being recorded for all of human history is his wandering journey almost to getting into the promised land but didn't get to. That is way more important and significant than his life in the palace. I tend to think, hey, God, you know what would be most important? Would be like the good stuff, the cush stuff, the stuff that's Instagram worthy. And God's like, yeah, 10 sentences. Here's what's really awesome. Him wandering around with ungrateful people trying to figure out how to serve me. God's understanding of waiting and our understanding of waiting are not the same thing. And when we're from our side experiencing waiting, it hurts. And it does not feel great. Yet, if we'll understand that God is doing something in the process of waiting, we can find ourselves like Moses, whereas I didn't grow dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. Which means not only was he able to see life and perspective properly at 120 years old, he still had strength. He had every right to be disillusioned. He had every right to be overcome with those feelings of waiting that David described. He had every right to finish with his vision diminished. But it says it wasn't, and he was stronger. Which leads me to believe that while waiting feels like it's the end of our strength, it's actually the beginning. Waiting makes you feel like you're becoming weak. But the process of waiting actually produces strength. Waiting makes you feel like you've been forgotten. ... I think God got the message. I don't know why he's replying back. Maybe he forgot that I sent it. Maybe my conversation to him moved off the first page and I've fallen into oblivion somewhere. Waiting makes me feel like I've been forgotten. But it's actually a sign of remembrance. Because when God went and tapped Moses after 80 years, 40 in the backside of nowhere, it said God heard and remembered. So even though you and I wait, God is not forgotten. He brings us into waiting seasons and brings us through those feelings to produce, I think, the opposite. Waiting makes you feel like you're never going to see the promise. But I would venture to say it's actually the key to getting vision. What waiting produces is actually the opposite of what waiting feels like it's going to produce. So the question then to me is, how do I wait when those annoying 3 dots are moving across my life? How do I wait in such a way that the feelings that are so real, like David described, that my eye is going to go dim, is there a way in which I can wait that while it feels like my eye is going to go dim, the reality is at the end, my eye never goes dim? And the answer is yes. We're going to look at 4 super quick things that Moses did in the process of waiting. And those 4 things helped him not succumb to the feelings that are so real and evident when we're waiting, but actually produce the results that God desires by our waiting. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 25 to 27 describes a couple things about Moses. So speaking of Moses, the text says he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt. Not fearing the king's anger, he persevered because he saw him who was invisible. With hindsight looking back, understanding that Moses finished his journey in a place of strength and vigor and with his eye clear and not dim, able to see what God was doing. This is how the writer of Hebrews describes, and there's 4 things in here that it tells us Moses did. Look how it starts off. It says he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasure of sin for a short time. Here's the first thing you and I can do, is that we can choose God's way over the easy way. He chose God's way over the easy way. When you and I are in a place of waiting, there will always be options to escape. Always. When you and I are in a place of waiting, there will always be ejector seats handles to pull. There will always be ways out of it that are easier than God's way of through it. And every single one of those easier ways will produce something less than what God has for your life. Every one of them. There is no easier way than the way that God has for you that will produce life and blessing. They don't exist. And it says that Moses chose the hard way of walking with God rather than the pleasures of sin in the palace. My man was rolling with the Pharaoh of Egypt. And he chose a different way during the process of waiting. He said, I'm going to do this God's way over the easy way. And no matter what situation in which you find yourselves, either to grab hold of the next season that God has for you or to get out of this season you don't want to be in, whatever option is presented to you, other than God's process of waiting, my friends, it will not produce the results you desire. At some point, you'll have a dim eye. And at some point, it will cost you your strength. Waiting for God's way will not dim your eye and will keep you strong. The text goes on and says in verse 26, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. So here's the second thing he did, and you and I need to do, is choose value over treasure. Choose value over treasure. The only time treasure is more valuable than value is immediately. But the thing about treasure is that always, with nothing done to continue to enhance it, it always decreases in usable value over time. If I took a $100 bill out of my pocket, I could go buy something with it. If I took that $100 bill and I hid it under this stage, and 50 years from now I pulled it out, I could not buy the same things that I bought with it before. Because just by virtue of life moving forward, the treasures of today are of less value tomorrow. I would have to take that and work with it and grind with it and invest it and pray over it and see a whole bunch of external stuff to it happen for it to even keep pace with the deteriorating value of treasure in the earth. Treasure doesn't get more valuable over time as life moves. It decreases. The only time treasure is better is right now, as soon as I get it. And the temptation when we're in places of waiting is to grab the quick, to grab the gold, to grab the shiny. But here's the thing about value, is value, while it may not feel as awesome at the very beginning, over time increases. You can go the treasure route and land a big fish client for your business. Eventually, if that's all you've produced, you're not worth as much as you were when you first landed it. But if you do such good work, you serve your clients and your bosses and you're excellent in what you do, that you add value to your company, that the product is better and your customers are well satisfied, they start coming in over time. And the value you add will add increase to the company in increasing measure over time. 10 years from now, you've added way more valuable than one big fish at the beginning. You and I should choose the way of greater value and not settle for something as temporary as treasure. And the way of God, while I'm waiting, may be hard, and there might be escape routes that look better in the short term, but the true value? Moses chose Christ. To choose Christ and to choose godliness is always of increasing in value in every facet of your life and mine. Every time. The text goes on. And it says that for the sake of Christ is a greater value than the treasures of Egypt. It says because he was looking ahead to his reward. Here's your next thing. Look for the reward over the answer. You know why waiting is hard? Is because we're looking for an answer. And nowhere in Scripture does God say he's going to answer your questions and mine. And quite honestly, he doesn't owe us answers. But when I focus on my situation, I'm like, God, I need to know. It's ... God, I need the answer ... God, I need the answer. At some point, I become disheartened because I'm focused on the fact that I can't get out of this situation or move into the next situation without the answer. And what God actually promises us is reward. Which, by the way, he doesn't owe us. But out of his goodness and kindness, he decides to reward us for walking with him. Which means I may never get the answer that I'm staring for and asking for, and am now growing frustrated and weary and bleary-eyed and feel like I'm drowning in my life situation because God is not giving me the answer. And he says, Moses chose to look at the reward. There is a reward for waiting well. So if I know that there's something waiting for me of value on the other side of this wait, bring it on. If I know God's going to reward me, he's going to upgrade my life by virtue of me walking well through a waiting season, let's do it. Even if I don't have all the answers of what he's trying to do, if I know it produces in me something of great reward, then let's take it on. I move from frustrated that I don't have an answer to anticipatory that this process is producing something of value and reward. That's how you wait well and end strong. And then here's the last one. It says, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. The last thing that you and I can do to help you wait well and wait in a strong way is to see the invisible over the visible. Crazy thing about waiting is while you're waiting and you look around, it feels like everybody else is moving. What's visible is people getting ahead of you. And what's visible is you not moving forward. I don't have progress I can measure. I'm like, I don't have an answer from God, and I look around and it feels like everyone else does and every other thing is moving. And when I look at the visible, I can get disheartened. How am I still at this age and still at this stage of my job? How am I still at this age and still at this stage of life? Oh God, we want to cry out till we're dry-throated and raspy. Why haven't you moved yet? Yet. Dot, dot, dot. Dot, dot, dot. After annoying, dot, dot, dot. Because we look at the visible. But what it says of Moses is he saw not just the invisible, but him who is invisible. That there is a God who is outside of time and space, and he is good and majestic and powerful in all his ways. And Moses understood that if there is a God who is good, and the season for me is to not move forward, then God somehow knows things I don't know, and my best interest is being worked out. When I look at the visible, I have a hard time seeing that God's good. I have a hard time understanding why, if God's powerful, why didn't he change this? If God's good, why doesn't he move the way I kind of am telling him to move? But when I start with the understanding that there is a God who is sovereign and is good and desires that at the end of my days, my eyes wouldn't be dim. At the end of my days, I would still have the vigor of my youth. Then I can understand that for some reason, he must know that there's a process. And I look at him and not that which is visible. Here's the thing about waiting too. I lean a lot more David. I feel like waiting is agony. And it's only with hindsight that I can look back with moments of Moses and go, wow, that waiting actually produced something in me. But here's the thing about waiting, is it feels like while we're waiting that God is slow. Doesn't it? God, why don't you hurry up? God, what's your problem? Hello, I've been ready forever. And the problem is we feel like we're waiting for God to catch up, and the reality is God's waiting for us. Most of the waiting process isn't because God's not ready, it's because we're actually not. Most of the waiting process isn't because God's slow to get things right. He's waiting to forge character in us enough to handle what he has for us. You know who's doing the waiting, actually? It's God. It's not you and me. So when we get frustrated with him, we should be very thankful that he doesn't choose and actually display his frustration toward us. Instead, he displays Christ and love and mercy. And somehow in his goodness, he decides to allow my nature to be changed from the way it used to be into the way of Jesus. And that process takes a little bit, so he waits for me. And then somehow he rewards me for allowing it. God's pretty awesome. over the next couple weeks, we're going to keep talking about this process of sitting in those 3 dots. And I'm thinking if we will continually choose God's way over our way, continue to choose value over treasure, continue to look for reward over the answer, and choose to see the invisible over the visible, even though waiting doesn't feel good, we'll start to see the good that's produced by it. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for the truth of your word. I thank you that it is living and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. And God, I thank you every purpose for which you send your word into the earth will be accomplished. Let this word speak to us. Let it cut us. Let it encourage us. Let it shape wherever we are in the process of waiting. That the feelings of disillusionment and exasperation that are so close, God, I'm thanking you we wouldn't give in to those, but instead would live with eager anticipation of what you'll produce through this process. In the name of your Son, Jesus.
Thank you, Pastor Keith. Thank you guys for joining us. Just a quick reminder, next Sunday service times are going to be 9:15 and 11. Go ahead and sign up on the app for those, as well as any other events, anything we have coming up, you can discover there as well. You guys have a great Sunday. We'll see you next week.